Hello, everyone. It's kind of funny walking into a room and seeing a range of black boxes, isn't it? But welcome on behalf of the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies and the Centre for Heritage at the University of Kent. As you heard, I started recording this meeting, so it will be available for people who want to check in on some of the conversation again after the event. I'm delighted today to welcome Alexandra Alberda and Shelley Saggar, both of whom are doing incredible work in their respective museums. One of our priorities at the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies at the University of Kent is in promoting and supporting Indigenous-led and Indigenous-centred research that's actively reshaping how Indigenous histories are framed, presented and understood in the UK, and that renegotiates the relationship between British institutions and Indigenous communities. It's hard to think of many more immediate or potent examples of that kind of work than the work that both Alex and Shelley are engaged in. So thank them for sharing their time and expertise with us. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today. Before I hand over to Shelley, I just want to invite my colleague, Sophie Vigneron, to say a few words about the Centre for Heritage.
Thank you, David. I just want to say a few words about the Centre for Heritage, and thanks, David, as well, who organised this meeting and invited the Centre for Heritage to cooperate with it. I think the aim of the Centre for Heritage is actually to develop a multidisciplinary approach on the protection of heritage, because heritage is such a wide concept that includes tangible objects that might be found in museums, but not just in museums. It's also about buildings, but it's also about the intangible heritage and the know-how and the cultural significance of those objects that are in museums. So what the Centre for Heritage aims to do is bring people who work in different disciplines, such as architecture, history, or heritage studies, museum studies, and law. I'm a lawyer myself, so to see how we can actually strengthen our respective research or respective discipline field so that we can develop a better understanding of what heritage is and how to protect and preserve heritage. So I'm extremely happy to just listening to this talk. It's the first time I'm actually listening to a talk organized by the Centre for Indigenous Studies. So it's really great to be able to work in an environment in the university where we have experts in so many different fields. So thank you for inviting us, and I'm really pleased, Alexandra, to hear you today.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So one piece of housekeeping, which I've already put in the chat, please keep microphones off if you can. There will be a Q&A, and obviously we will invite people to speak their questions if they want to, but also please do feel free to use the chat if you want to leave questions there along the way. So I'm going to introduce Shelley, and then Shelley will introduce Alexandra, and then the conversation will begin. So Shelley Angelie Saggar is a Chase-funded PhD student and museum worker based across the School of English and the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies here at the University of Kent. Her research examines contestations and reclamations of the museum in Native North American and Maori cultural texts. She also works as a collections researcher at the Science Museum, where her focus is on developing protocols for managing culturally sensitive items in the historical medical collections. So, Shelley, over to you.
Thanks, David. And hi, everybody. We're really pleased to be able to welcome you to the virtual campus of the University of Kent today. Thank you so much for joining us and for making time. As David mentioned, my name's Shelley. I'm a second-year PhD student here at Kent in the School of English, and I'm just really delighted today to be able to welcome Alexandra Alberda to speak with us all today. Alex and I have been chatting for many months now about how best to make this event happen. So it's great to finally have the space and time to convene a conversation with you all. Thank you so much to David and to Sophie at the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies and the Centre for Heritage, respectively, for helping us to put this event together today. So Alex Alberda, PhD, is the first ever curator of Indigenous Perspectives at the Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester. She joined Manchester Museum from Bournemouth University, where she was a doctoral researcher in graphic medicine and curatorial practice, and also worked as a research illustrator, working on the data storytelling workbook, which was published by Routledge in 2020. Her research and practice critically engages with institutional structures of power that limit civic engagement and do not facilitate needed reparative reconciliation, amplification of marginalized voices, and displacement of colonial power. Alex, we're just really, really pleased to be able to welcome you here today. I can't actually see you because of Zoom being weird, but it's nice to have you here with us. Thanks so much for making time to join us today.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and thanks to everyone for the nice welcomes, as well as everyone who attended.
Yeah, the pleasure is all ours, really. I'm sure everybody is really excited to hear what you have to say and hear a bit more about the work as well. So we've structured this event as a kind of in conversation, but we will ensure plenty of time for questions at the end, because I'm sure everyone will have a lot to contribute to the discussion and to ask Alex. Again, if I can just remind everyone, because I think I can still hear some microphones, please do remain muted until the Q&A session. That'd be great, just help us keep things running really smoothly. And as David mentions, please feel free to use the chat, pop any questions you might have there. We'll make sure we get to them. Oh, David is patrolling the chat, so yes, sounds good. Yeah, pop your questions in the chat, or if you can kind of hang on to them until the end, just signal to David or myself. Once we get to that section, we'll make sure to kind of come to you to air those. So I suppose just by way of opening things up, Alex, I'm conscious that we always tend to start these kinds of events with a string of very formal, introductions and professional kind of qualifications, which are obviously really important. Your kind of background is obviously so interesting. People are very keen to hear about it. But I wondered if, just by way of kind of breaking the ice a bit, you might like to introduce yourself a little bit more personally, maybe as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I was planning on doing that too, because it becomes so important when we talk about the program. So my name is Alexandra Alberda, but also my name is Blue Corn Frawa. So I am mixed heritage. I am part Jemez Pueblo. That's where the blue corn comes from. And for anyone who that is not familiar, and hopefully shouldn't be all that familiar, because we believe in oral tradition and not recording our culture and language, and everything like that, but is in modern day kind of New Mexico, just outside of Albuquerque, is where you'll find the Jemez of Pueblo if you look that up. That's where part of my family on my dad's side is from. My mom's side of the family, and part of my dad's side of the family is both French and British Canadian that then came down into Montana. And so we have settler history, as well as my mom's side, who claim to be 100% Dutch. We would like to do a little bit of a genealogy on that one. But so, and in all my family, to kind of relate to land and place, is from either side you'll find farmers and growers and really careful, and not the commercial way of doing it, but that really careful intergenerational kind of interaction with the lands, both in the area now known as New Mexico and the area now known as Montana. So that's where I come from. So I have a bit of always growing up in a threshold, which I think is well suited kind of for the work that I do, because I have that bit of understanding from both that different histories within myself as well as realities.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that really helps, to kind of open up how people are coming to this sort of work. It can often sort of feel like we're just, reeling off a CV, when actually it is a lot more personal often as well. Yeah, I wondered if you might just quickly sort of give us an overview of the work that's starting at Manchester, the Indigenising Manchester Museum project, maybe its kind of ambitions and how it sits within the wider work that Manchester are kind of doing around rethinking the context and the inheritances of their collection?
Yeah, so the Indigenizing Manchester Museum program is a John Ellerman funded program. So it's initially just a 2-year program, but don't worry, the intention is always for this to continue, but that kind of funds curatorial activity that is aimed at organizational development. So I work with curators, I work across teams. Shelley, you will know because Shelley gave an amazing talk, which led to actually a lot of inspired kind of tours and projects as part of our speaker series. But focusing on activity that is linked to organizational development, which I think is really important because oftentimes we can get funding to put on events, and maybe they get framed as decolonial work or they get framed in these different ways, but there's not actually that conscious sit down to think about how that gets into the power structures and as well as the knowledge structures that happen in museums. And we have, if anyone isn't familiar with Manchester Museum, it has both natural history as well as ethnographic, ethnology collections. So it's a bit of a collection of everything. There's even a bit of art in there that we have a partnership, so some of that goes elsewhere. But so we have vast different types of academic kind of disciplines that feed into the structure of how the museum was formed. And Sam Alberda has written a book, Nature versus Culture, that anyone who wants to know more about the history of the museum. But my role's ambition was to bridge that gap with knowledge as well, so that decolonial indigenization doesn't just happen with us humanities curators and anyone doing humanities work, but actually it's just as important for the natural history collections and the different experts that are working in there. And so I'm supposed to not work in silos. If there's any curators here, you might feel the bane of your existence working in a silo in that discipline and then always feeling you're repeating work or not being able to penetrate these other disciplines. And so I sit across, I don't man a collection, which means I can focus a lot of my time on that type of development. And so because our museum is closed right now for Hello Future, which is our capital development project, we'll have new galleries, and the Indigenizing Manchester Museum program, which I might call IMM sometimes. I'm sorry, I'll try not to speak in awful acronyms. But that kind of sits alongside that. So as we're doing this huge capital development project, we're redoing our education programming, we're redoing our engagement, visitors, actual gallery content, and looking to the future with what happens once we open. Is my role is to make sure that decolonial action and processes are happening, not tokenistically, like real stuff, but seeing those as processes that are about us. So what I like to make sure my colleagues know is that decolonization is about the institutions, because it has to be, because you're decolonizing yourselves. So to think that those acts share power equally with other people, I think it doesn't quite sit where with what needs to be unpicked as well, because that should be with museums, not with other people. It's our responsibility to unpick that. But we can bring in indigenization and we can bring in partnerships, but it needs to be in confronting that. Whereas indigenization is a step beyond that. It's where we get to step back. But we need to be conscious of how we do that so that we're still not reiterating those powers distribution that's uneven. And so I run a lot of workshops because I've worked in organizational health, organizational development in public health in the UK with Public Health Dorset. And that's something that I was doing alongside my PhD. So there's lots of talks, learning from experts, and then saying, you didn't just go to this nice talk. What actions are we going to make because this talk is here? And like yourself, the big calls to action that you gave, others have, and we're sitting with that and thinking, how do those feature in policy? How do they feature in toolkits that will go out to help others who, bigger institutions who maybe the directors don't have the remit to do this type of work and allocate these resources, smaller institutions that don't have that capability. So it's looking at the different levels we do that. But so it's, I guess that's a there's a lot of things. I do a lot of random things. I've also got to go out to schools in our Inflatable museum to teach on Indigenous gardening, which was the greatest thing I've ever done in the last year, I think. But it's making sure that I run pilots with everyone. Everyone knows I'm coming for them, and we're going to run a pilot on something so that they can redo that learning, but always in confronting ourselves and making sure that we understand we need to confront our knowledge in construction of it before we can go forward, so that we can see those parts that don't match up with our ambitions. But I'm hoping for us to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable so we can do the right work.
Yeah, it sounds like such exciting work that's going on at Manchester. Definitely in the time you've been there, and even kind of, you know, the other projects that they're running alongside the Indigenizing the Museum projects. I mean, it just sounds brilliant. I can't wait to see what happens once you guys reopen again as well. Also, I have to ask quickly, is your inflatable museum, is it actually inflatable? Like, what is this? That sounds brilliant.
It is actually inflatable.
Wow.
And it's huge. It's one of those projects though that I think there was big ambitions, and then we just have a great team. But yeah, it fills a school lunchroom. It's quite large. You can fit, I think, like 30 kids and teachers in it. But it's quite a nice bit, and we were able to sit in a big circle. But it's to recreate that experience of going to museums and going to the museum to create that atmosphere, but in a fun kind of. It almost looks like a bouncy house, but without the floor. And it's really heavy.
Oh my God. Yeah, that sounds brilliant. I love this kind of idea, you know, that you brought up about, yeah, that sort of public engagement side of things, bringing in communities, doing all that exciting work. But then also, you know, turning your attention to work that, I mean, I think it's exciting, you think it's exciting, but a lot of people might not necessarily think it's as glamorous, right, as the kind of programming aspect of things. But that sort of internal attention, I think, is so important, right? And we are seeing a growing interest in the UK, all over the world as well, but definitely here in the UK, in decolonisation as a kind of term, as a program. And you've sort of mentioned in your overview of what you do, or you sort of hinted at maybe a distinction between decolonisation and indigenisation. I think you used those two terms. They came up also in the readings you've suggested in advance of this session. And I just wondered, you know, if you might be able to speak to what those distinctions are. How do you understand the difference between those two terms?
Yeah, and I think it's really important. And I should start off and say it's contested, and you might read into something that fits with kind of your worldview or how kind of you're going out and doing that work. So I don't want to make it seem like I have the only definition, but in and like you say, we have that interest in power. So in my PhD, though it's about comics and health and exhibition, if you read into it, you'll realize that it's about epistemic violence and humility, and it's all about power. So that was really important to me. So in watching decolonial actions that happen at museums for, I don't know, the last 8 years, is I see a lot of ambitions for it to be about other people and to sharing power. But then sometimes I think that gets misused in order to bring in partners, but without confronting yourself. So I feel like decolonization needs to be, a lot of which is the reflection of museums, of teams, of people. So all the way from just my personal kind of ideas of knowledge and colonialism and power structures, all the way out to what is the organizational climate, what is the organizational culture around this, and the ideas. Because decolonization, you're decolonizing a museum, so it has to be about the museum. It has to be about its powers and its histories. And in order for that to happen, the museum needs to stay in the center of that for at least that part of it. And it might be, and it's a process. So decolonization isn't something that we'll ever achieve. And if anyone's trying to tell you to try to achieve a decolonized museum, you've already failed, because it needs to be a process, because it needs to be reflective, because what we might say is politically correct now, in 5 years' time, it won't be. There'll be something else that we didn't think of. People change, cultures change, social things change, and so it needs to be a part of a process. And I think that's the same for indigenization as well. But decolonization is about, for us, Manchester Museum at the center. Now, all the people that determine what happens doesn't have to be the museum, but I think the responsibility of the provenance research that goes into that, or the different acts, need to be the people who make up the everyday of that museum, who are trained for that, who have then the support, or hopeful support, to, if you need to see a therapist during that time, or to be able to step away and look at other things, where you won't get if you bring in just a focused group that doesn't have that type of support. And a part of that is the call to action from Rosalind Lapierre, who spoke for the Indigenizing Manchester Museum, saying that when we bring people in, we need to change our processes so that we actually confront ourselves before they confront us. So even if it's a really niche kind of topic that maybe isn't in my specialism, I still need to do that work, rather than just say, oh yes, come in, there might be some racist stuff in those folders, just so you know, check, I've been trauma informed. So in actually doing a lot of that work to see who we are, and not saying you hide anything, but so that you know that experience, you can prepare people in a more informed way. So I feel like the museum, its building, its history, its structures stay so much in the center of the decolonization. Indigenization, I think, is where you can say, this building, check that out. Like, actually, what do Indigenous peoples want from us? What kind of programs, what kind of projects? And it might even be that we step out into an area that a program you might not think a museum would do, because we're not at the center of those needs, but we might be supporting it in different ways. Are we someone who can access funding? Are we someone who comes in for like 15 minutes to show some objects virtually? Are we a place and a space that can be transformed and used and narrated, and not be the approvers? I think that's the other thing, is with indigenization, then it becomes very clear we can't be the final say. We can maybe have discussions, and I have had discussions, for instance, in a blogging gallery I'm leading on, one case is going to be on repatriations, and I did have a conversation where I said, because I knew a comic was going to have depictions of spears and war, and just let them know that across the gallery would be a story about a Syrian refugee experience. And so the people we'd be bringing in to view that might be coming from recent war. So it was more a conversation of just keeping people informed and building an ethics of care together. But then when the comic came through, which brilliant, and probably from the beginning, used iconography mixed with like human face. It's a brilliant comic by Eder Noombi. Look up Noombi on social media. He's fantastic. But when it came in, he said, "Is this okay?" And I was like, "That's not my point. I whatever you sent me, I'm gonna display. My role is to make sure it gets displayed." So I think so I think it's being upfront where that power is and how much room people have. Whereas in indigenization, if there ever is that feeling of, oh, no, that's not what I thought this was going to be, or oh, but we said this, or this was the direction we'd really like. Any of those feelings that come to approval or trying to control it, that's not, you've just lost the plot. It's not indigenization anymore. But in going through these things, it's okay to stumble. It's when we're reflective of that stumbling, because I've certainly done it with other things where I've gone, I thought it was this thing, and then confronting myself. But it's stumbling through that and acknowledging that and just being more equipped to have that reflection of where power is sitting. So I don't know if those are very concise definitions of the two, but it's down to power and knowledge and validation, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really helpful. That's really kind of clear, and really nice to sort of think about how you are enacting some of those kind of philosophies in your work at Manchester as well. It really strikes me, that the kind of key thing there is really about responsibility, taking responsibility, getting our own house in order before inviting people in, right, to kind of come and look at the mess. And this is a museum secret for everybody. Know half of the stuff that's in the collection, right? Like, it's badly labeled, it's kind of really disorganized, not to, devalue the excellent work that our colleagues do, in terms of researching and kind of caring for this material, but it's quite messy as well, some of this work. So I think it really is, you're right about kind of accounting for that before we let people, not even let people, before we sort of invite people to respond to that, because that can be quite difficult, that can be traumatic. I think for museum workers as well, who are trying to do, the right thing, that can be a very difficult conversation to kind of bring people in, ask them to look at some of this material and then expect them to respond in a very kind of cogent or productive way. That can't really be how we operate. So I really appreciate your sort of drawing out of the distinctions there. So in the Indigenization is Indigenous article you shared, I wonder actually, David, if you're around, if we might pop the link to it in the chat, just so people can sort of have it up to browse while we're chatting. But that article really sort of calls attention to this idea of responsibility, and it sort of suggests that there's a role for settlers in doing some of that work. I wonder, obviously that article is kind of very specifically looking at a Canadian context, I think, and I wonder if you might be able to kind of think about how we might reframe the role of audiences in a UK context as well. It strikes me that it is a very different sort of responsibility, but there definitely is a responsibility there as well, even if it feels a bit further away.
Yeah, and I think what's so important is that distance, because when reflecting and talking back to family or others who I've worked with as partners or just had chats with once I've got my job, who are working with Indigenous perspectives, but maybe in different countries, they've asked, what is the difference in the UK? And I think it is that distance, that physical distance. So for that, just when you're in a context within a community or on Indigenous people's traditional lands and making your living, I think not everyone, you have to be looking for it and absorbing it when you see it, but you come into contact with these. And even if it's something where, and I forget the psychological term for it, but once somebody brings it up, you hear it a bunch of times after that. But is you pick up bits and pieces as you're in these contexts. But in the UK, with that distance, I feel that there is a responsibility to be up to date. I've, even from well-intentioned people, have heard the term red used quite as a good thing. It was in my local newspaper in the crossword even, shortly after I moved in, which was disappointing because I was going to start doing crosswords and now I don't. But just that wasn't updated, and because there isn't as much, whereas I feel like I haven't heard something like that except for by racists back in America in so long, or that equivalent. And so I think there is a responsibility to be up to date with names, to take that moment. It doesn't take long to search is this an okay term? I have to do it myself, especially, for instance, when I'm looking up Indigenous nations and peoples in Africa, because Africa isn't my expertise or an area I've looked at before, but I make sure to do that moment to look it up, look for the different laws that are happening, which the lawyer in the room might be very happy with, but I look up, I'm very litigious, but looking up the laws and kind of the political context so I can understand. So I think that's another responsibility, is trying the different ways to understand where peoples are at, not only historically, because I think it gets historicized too much, but what are the concerns today? So we watched a film that was created in conversation with the Sami people by Päivi, which called The Reindeer Belong to the Wind. And I showed it to my colleagues, and that was our most recent kind of activity. And we'll be responding to it in workshops next month. But they appreciated so much how that film was just so many layers of contemporary issues that were important. And I think when you look into that and you see Indigenous peoples kind of thinking about land rights or where that oil is going to be drilled, or things that start to relate to your own life, I think you start to stop historicizing peoples. I mean, there's a responsibility to look that up. I've also several times had to say to people here in the UK that you do know Indigenous people have TVs and Wi-Fi, right? It sounds so ridiculous. Usually people then laugh embarrassed, but it's that it's that simple of stuff, that it's confronting that and then starting to think, what other stereotypes and asks and representations are we asking for? Last year, the National Geographic photographer Kil Yuan did a talk for the, I believe it was the Welsh Royal Geographical Society. I could be wrong. But one thing he really talked about was the importance, and quite eloquently, the importance of the different stereotypes when we ask Indigenous people to be involved in something, because we have that distance. We only see these representations and we don't think about how the media is forming those and not people in everyday lives, is either, and for anyone who's not looking, I'm using air quotes, these are not appropriate terms, these are just the terms that are used by peoples, is the noble savage role, or kind of the drunken savage, and those are the stereotypes that I know in our community we always try to say, like, this is a thing. We're not the shamans that are going to cure everything, and we're not idiots with no agency and who can't understand how colonialism continues to impact us. But as soon as you paint someone in that way, especially through programming or your stories or your museum exhibitions or displays, if anyone in those communities, or if you're so general that it's Indigenous peoples anywhere, any person who could be Indigenous from anywhere across the world makes a human mistake, and it just unravels arguments. It creates these fallacies. So I think it's trying to see people as human and seeing where people are being made spectacular, even in our programming that's really well intentioned. So I think in the UK, it's also worth noting that I've run up against kind of really racist things that come from all political affiliations. In fact, when my job got announced, there was a comment on Twitter by a person who I think they meant well, and they were on their liberal watchdog phase, but saw my picture, didn't click into the link, and immediately commented back on a post that they hired a white lady. So it also is thinking about, who do you think are Indigenous people? Do they have to look like Pocahontas? Ooh. But then sitting with that kind of, because a lot of, I think, anti-racist work around here doesn't confront mixed race experience, or doesn't confront anything that isn't that dichotomy what early critical race theory was heavily criticized for in that white versus Black, but actually looking at Indigenous experience within that. So I think it's sitting quite critically of ourselves is always important, but then thinking about not just reacting to what makes it to the media or makes it to like mainstream kind of education or programming, and inquiring more. So seeing that as a springboard to then going and doing more research and trying to see these things, because then people start to just come out of these kind of representations. So I think that's probably really important. I've faced that throughout my entire life, so I'm able to go, okay, ooh, gotta have a come to Jesus talk, as they say. But not everyone is ready for that, and it can become a very unwelcome space.
Yeah,
but I think that would be my call to the UK.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really valuable. I think also, yeah, that kind of, real like historical illiteracy that we have still in the UK about, about colonialism in general, but then certainly about our role, our continuing role, right? Like, particularly around like crown land rights, all those sorts of things that we are still very heavily involved in. That there's just kind of a very, real lack of kind of knowledge or a knowledge about. I don't think there's necessarily a lack of interest in, as you kind of say, there are like incidents in the media that get reported that generate a lot of really well-meaning support, even if it's not kind of, fantastically sort of up to date on the specificities of what's going on. I think it's really interesting, you brought up these kinds of liberal, well-meaning sympathies and how they might, get kind of tangled in actually really problematic language or assumptions as well. I think this is such a British thing about, this is what we're famous for, right? But it reminds me of the second piece you shared, which was titled "A Comment on Indigenous Erasure in Ontology-Related Archaeologies." We will share around the PDF for that for anyone who would like to revisit that as well following the event. But this piece really kind of critiques the romanticization of Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies by Western anthropologists and archaeologists in particular, who sort of see these frameworks, the article suggests, as, being able to solve all of our problems. I mean, already a really interesting distinction between them and us in this kind of assumption. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that piece and on, I suppose whether you think that this increased attention to these paradigms from UK institutions in particular runs this risk of essentially getting caught in a very problematic re-romanticization of these knowledges as well. So even when we're trying to do a good thing, like we're reaching for a good thing, we can get caught up maybe. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yes, and it's such a good point because, and I'm sure that in 5-10 years from now, I'm going to look back on things even I said and go, ooh, and I think that's important. Like, no, everyone should kind of expect that, but not be too scared to not try to go forward. I think one thing, if we're thinking about the article and thinking about that, the romanticization, what's really important is thinking about how that gets reiterated through academia and sources. So it has to be a certain type of source from a certain type of valued, air quotes, writer or author or validation structure. So like journal articles that have been peer reviewed by who. But so thinking about how those are methods that as researchers, we have to do that. I don't know about anybody who's a PhD student now or did a PhD or didn't do one because of this, but that feeling of awkwardness where I have to have a certain source to say what I want to say, even though I have tons of these other sources that have the knowledge that I want. By the way, if I ever send something and somebody says, oh, you need to find a more legit source for this, I'm going to ignore you, as I have ignored those other comments, because you're just not up to speed with me. But thinking about those types of things, because I think they get built into how we build knowledge, and it might be a reaction, and maybe some people in here are going, ooh, I think I've done that within the last week. But thinking about how and what's the purpose of that knowledge, because maybe that's not the most important way. And so I think the romanticization is also confronting, if I'm in that system of citing, in that system of knowledge validation, then my limited resources of who I can cite were maybe embroiled in even worse off and less self-reflective and self-critical kind of academics and stories. And I've even have great colleagues who've written on this even more, who talk about really also looking at the lens through which any of that knowledge is written. So even if I interviewed someone, well, I wouldn't do this in Hamas, but a Hopi relative, and asked them, it's still me who's writing that down. It's still me who's deciding what parts of the interview transcript goes in, the framing that readers will encounter before they come up against it. So it's also confronting how then that relates to your sources. And so that's just looking at what stories you're pulling from, especially if you're in academic settings. And to break from that, you really need collaboration. And I think we need to be more and more comfortable with collaboration, even within PhDs, even within different types of research projects that normally have a single author, and looking at how we then need to change how we validate knowledge and someone's knowledge, because I hated that as part of my PhD. And in fact, I illustrated one of the interview chapters so that at least the word bubbles were coming out of the depictions of the people who said them, as a reminder that this isn't me. This brilliant quote was not me. Now, I still curated that page. I acknowledge that. I talk about that. But the different types of resistance that we can do to that type of way of presenting knowledge. And I think when you're working in collaboration and you're thinking about not having to be the person who came up with that brilliant quote through citing someone else, that the different ways you can highlight who that came from and incorporate that into how you build stories. And it might be, it's also about letting go. So you can move away from that romanticism and that extraction that's talked about in that article if you let people be people and also steer where you're going. And I think also just realizing that, because for me, it's about cultural revitalization and healing through these types of spaces. Acknowledging that the people it relates to will get more out of this than you ever will. And that should be the point. So letting them shape where that goes, and really confronting that Western view of ownership and authorship is from an individualist society, whereas, and a lot, and not even just Indigenous peoples, but there's, and not all of them, because some have moved in different ways, but many of them are built on community-based. And so what is the example I always give is, I taught English in Thailand. And I'm not trying to say that I taught English to Indigenous peoples in Thailand. I had a few Hmong people in the classroom, but not many. But I remember when they took a test, I caught them cheating every time. And my Western response was going to go, how dare you? How could you? Now, if it was really obvious, that was just an offensive to me. I usually called it out and asked them to at least be creative. But I remember having a great conversation with one of the teachers that said, you're thinking about this wrong. They're not making a slight on you. They're not thinking, oh, we're getting away with it. Haha, teacher's so stupid. but they're seeing their classmates struggle. And in that kind of collectivist way of approaching things is they want to raise everyone up. Everyone leave with the same knowledge, with the same marks, with that same base level. So I'm going to help out my buddy. I mean, they're not then thinking that, they're just writing down A, B, C, D. but there's that want to help in community, and the fact that that justifies breaking from that individualist approach. So I know that's about like marking and my students over here, but I think it's one way of thinking through that. Maybe if you're in that situation, would you be going, I got my mark on my own and they got a better mark, but that's because they cheated. Like, what is that? Like, it's built from these systems we've created around each other to compete with each other, to have that authorship, that ownership, just us. But when we change that that situation and go, well, I just want to see what I'll get on my own, so I'm not going to cheat this time, but not to judge over here. So I think if we then think about more collaboration, think about who we're going to and the different kind of systems all these past authors and romantics were a part of, is to break from that. And then you can let more people be a part of the collaborative process. And I hope that that stops it. But if the instinct is then to go off and be a single author about a community you're not a part of, and to raise that kind of awareness without first checking what needs to be raised. So sometimes I'm not saying don't write a paper with your own, only you as a byline, but how would you, in thinking about what are the sources you use to say that this is an issue? This is the thing that people are interested in. Because when I asked a group of Indigenous people from around the world when I first got my job, it was somebody else's consultation, but I asked them if I could cheekily come along and ask people, because they have people from everywhere. I asked, what could our programming be about? And I was quite surprised. Well, with my role, ecological thinking and language revitalization, I thought anti-racism was going to feature there. I thought, I mean, this is why I also don't approach things from what my assumptions, because look how wrong I would have been over the last year. But then I can go and take that and lead that into my programming. And so I think there's different points where people can ask for direction and ask for collaboration that will resist that romanticization, because you couldn't do those things ill-intentioned if you had a critical friend in the room that was like, oh, you know, I wouldn't go in that direction. Whereas if you're off alone constantly and working from these rigid kind of ways of knowledge and sources and things like that, you're not going to have that person in the room, even if it's virtual.
Yeah, definitely. I think thinking about it as this kind of ongoing process, as a conversation, you know, I think it's quite tempting sometimes, even when we are wanting to do good work from institutions like museums and universities, to then kind of use the, you know, the sort of intellectual or cultural authority that these institutions still have, right, to then also kind of shield ourselves from you know, critical friends as well, even if we're kind of saying we really want this sort of perspective. I'm really intrigued that you brought up, you know, that the communities were so interested in kind of ecological thinking, because this is something that is definitely beginning to be, you know, it's kind of been its own strand in museum thinking, certainly, and definitely in universities and in activism too. But it strikes me that this is beginning to be connected with decolonial imperatives. Most obviously, you know, collectives like Decolonize This Place, BP or Not BP, have all kind of brought those conversations together in really, really exciting and urgent ways, I think, as well. And you and I have kind of talked previously about your thoughts on, you know, kind of how we might address these in museums, particularly by looking at natural history collections. I wondered if you just wanted to say a little bit about that, because I remember when you brought this up when we were speaking in the summer, it was just like mind blown. This is amazing. So if you want to just speak a little bit about how you're working, or how you're kind of bringing in natural history people and collections into your work as well.
Yeah, so I think I think there's multiple ways, because it has grown, because with those 2 calls to action, I've spent the last year going, how would we purposefully do language revitalization? I've cracked it. I think I've solved it. Keep your eyes on this one. But so I've been doing a lot around ecological thinking, and it's half the museum that's still installed. So that makes it easy too. But in looking at that is confronting the different concepts of nature. For many Indigenous peoples, the kind of concept of nature, the understanding of nature in English does not translate or does not have a word. So I'm not the person who's come up with that. There's many people who've talked more eloquently about that, because it's all about kinship, and you don't have to have a name for something that is all not outside of yourself in the same way as maybe we talk about nature as being the Peak District, which is right over here, to me, is far away, when actually I have a plant right here, or there's something questionable growing in the cracks, like at my previous apartment. But so that kind of natural world is all around us. And so been doing a lot more, because those collections are also steeped in scientific, academic, and been subject to narratives of objective knowledge, and that there's okay because parts of science are meant to be objective, but that's the ethno people. They do that part, so that's who you need to talk to. I should say most of my natural history colleagues have been on board with things, and actually couldn't wait until I started. But so we've been working through that in multiple ways, like school programs, but just with the programming and collections development as well. So what grants are we filling out, and what do we want to do to put these collections back into different cultural contexts, as well as kinship contexts. So trying to get back into that space. So sometimes it's telling a story about beaver to the Nemiapu or the Nez Perce, talking about the sacredness of kangaroos, and why sometimes their treatment is not culturally appropriate, and actually how many sacrilegious things happen with kangaroos in contemporary society, as well as a lot of work with botany, and looking at how the botany collections, what I'm really enjoying about working with them, and this is true of all the other natural history collections, and we're thinking about ecological action, is that these landscapes have been subject to monocrop farming, they've been subject to development, they've been subject to so much change with colonialism and industrialization across the world that we may no longer know what was there before if we don't engage with collections like this. And so how can we look at how those were framed, how they were put together, in order to start to think back to these lands, which hopefully will be returned to people as a part of what the Noongar call, this is not me, cultural revegetation. And so in these types of reclaiming of lands and trying to be in the land where there was kinship again, as much as you can, rather than an approach to like rewilding. If you look at the case of beavers in the UK, I don't know if England still does it this way, but Scotland, they reintroduced beavers, and Scotland was like, they're wild animals, we're not going to try to hold them to one place, that seems ridiculous. Whereas in England, they were like, you get this square, if you leave it, you die, or you get put back in this square. And so it was, so thinking about ecological action that happens elsewhere, but in an untouched way, in a very kind of subscribed or prescribed space, and not outside of that. Whereas different Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous initiatives are looking like, we need to let go of that idea with ecological action, and trying not to control, because wasn't that the thing that got us here, but actually looking at our kinship. And so trying to bring back cultural practices and different worldviews and ways of being in the world where it isn't about human control. We're not trying to be Adam in this garden that we inherit, but we are one part. And what do we do within that biosphere, within that kinship, to contribute to its growth? So is that, if you've read, anyone who's read Robin Wall Kimmerer knows that's what I'm leading up to, is braiding sweetgrass, is that we pick some of the wild strawberries? Is it we pick some of the grass? Are we helping out animals? Are we cleaning up certain areas? What was our natural, I don't really like that word, but what was our kind of kinship in these spaces that helped in that kind of relationship? So I think putting the human back into these landscapes as well, and thinking about that, because part of colonialism, especially with the national parks, was, especially in America, if you read through like parts of the reasons and the foundations of those, you'll find some really, not surprising, racist stuff about getting dirty Indians out of the landscape so that it can be beautiful again. Because how could they know how to be in it? And they ruin it by being here. And not that many years later, it's now ruined. So actually thinking about how to be in spaces within that kinship, and how can we do it with existing structures that are happening today? So it's not, let's bulldoze everything and go back to this way. But I mean, some people, yes. But for the most part, it's putting that cultural practice that was built in order for us to operate in kinship, and those different things. So I think that's, maybe I've lost the plot to your question, but I think that's kind of the exciting part of the action. So what are the different ways to inspire that? So like like in the schools program, one of the things we looked at was monocrop farming and decolonizing kind of our concepts of farming and things like that, but also medicine plants and how that then stopped all these medicine plants from having access. You don't know how many kids went, that plant, that grows in the cracks. We have that plant in the backyard. Or I think I see that when I walk to school. That's good for diabetes. And all of a sudden they started asking about plants for very specific things. So like one kid really wanted to know which one was good for lowering blood sugar. So you could tell they were talking about somebody, maybe themselves, maybe a family member, but it was asking questions about which one's good for anxiety, which one's this. But that was all framed in a gratitude model. So telling them from Robin Wall Kimmerer that our gift is gratitude. So they couldn't do anything in any of the exercises without thanking plants. So we got a bunch of feedback from the students, and some students were like, I need to kiss plants more. Yes, that's what I'm going to do going forward. But it was so much the reflections. It really, and we've caught up with them again several months later, and they're still talking about gratitude. Like, oh, that's how I need to be in the world, is gratitude. So I think it's also those bigger kind of concepts that change how we interact that we're hoping comes through in that kind of programming.
Yeah, definitely. That just sounds like such a lovely program to run, and so important. And I think, yeah, it's so important that we in museums try to kind of resituate those relationships that are so divided, right? As you say, into these are ethnographic collections, these are plant collections, these are, human civilizational collections. Might all be from the same place, but they're divided into kind of different, silos, as you were kind of talking about earlier. I'm so glad, that you kind of, were able to draw out those connections between, more ecological thinking and decolonial practice. I think these are going to be so important to join up in museums going forward as well. I'm conscious that we've got about 25 minutes left for questions. So maybe if we just open up to those. I can see there's some in the chat. Let me just bring that up, wherever it is. Okay. So we've got one question here. That says, Alexandra, you mentioned repatriation. Could you say a bit more about Manchester Museum's approach to it? What's their position? Any kind of work that you're doing around that?
Yeah. So if you look online, you will not find a repatriation policy for Manchester Museum. That is something that the head of collections and exhibitions noted, because George just started a little bit before I did, and she's definitely said, oh, we need one of those. So I'm not surprised that questions come up, which is in some ways nice, because there's not an existing structure we're trying to fight against in a repatriation policy. And we don't have a board of governors like many museums do, which is nice, because that also means there isn't a table of people in the same way that could say no, like the art museums I've worked with before, where a lot of things had to go through this board that wasn't a part of our daily kind of working. So we have a very open policy. We very much are trying to grapple with and understand UNDRIP and the different things put out in those policies. And we're not a national museum, so we're not going to hide behind the law as why we're not going to do things the same way, or be restricted by it, because I do know some colleagues at nationals that wish they had room. Because we're a university museum, we have a little bit of flexibility there. We will take on board any claim, anybody who reaches out. So then, like, if for somebody to reach out, we would do a bit of, I've actually done several this year, and just recently is some provenance research, so that we know everything that we could know about an object, an ancestor, an item, if I'm the right person. So we always ask, is it sacred and secret, and what are kind of the protocols for that? So there's some things I haven't been able to help with because it's men's business. So that's where we would then work with somebody. And we respond to the information we find. So we found out that there's some sacred objects that are in our database with pictures attached to them, which made it so my male colleague could very quickly turn around the information to the people who asked, but then had to be disassociated afterwards. So it's also, oh my goodness, figuring that out. So we're very open. We still do in due diligence, is making sure that this is the right kind of people. And by that, I don't mean, oh, they have a nice fancy museum it can go into. We're very open to unconditional return straight back into communities or to families, but it's just making sure that we don't get caught up in our own kind of ambitions and repatriate, but then actually find out we repatriated to the wrong community, especially if it's an ancestor. So that's kind of the process as we go through to understand. Sometimes going through them, we find out, actually, I think this object might not be what it was probably sold to somebody as at one point. But so it goes through that. And because we don't have that, it's very relationship focused. We take serious any claim. And we also are working through this idea of beyond the secret and sacred, because that's another layer that I think people, and this comes from our colleagues actually, who are based in Australia and have done these types of things. There's a lot of people go, oh, but if it's not secret and sacred, that's not a part of UNDRIP. Well, actually, as our colleagues pointed out, if you read other articles, you'll notice that it is much bigger. So I think my contribution from my own Indigenous lived experience and our very different cultural approach than some other communities is breaking down that idea that there is a secular in everyone's worldviews, because that's not true. And it might be that a cup is actually a part of a ceremony of passing on knowledge, but it isn't a sacred object in the same way, or a secret one, but it's a part of that process. So if you even think of bark paintings, there's a whole process of creating that is all about intergenerational knowledge being passed down, some of which is quite secret or sacred. And so we also don't hold ourselves to that. If it's a claim being made, we take it seriously no matter what it is. But you won't find one. You should find one soon. we are working on that. We're also redoing our it's called the human remains policy, but making sure that that's more ancestor focused, having different, or the plan is, because we just started that because we're waiting for the curator of living cultures to start, is having communities and different peoples that it would relate the most to actually be a part of making the policies. Novel idea, because it opens up. But I would say I don't get the sense that there is a majority fear of objects leaving. Or maybe I'm too bold and no one's expressed that to me in quite the same way.
No, I think, yeah, the work that, Manchester did with the Aboriginal items from Australia a couple of years ago, that was really fantastic. It definitely kind of set an example, I think, for others as well. And it is really important to have that flexibility that you do, that obviously the Nationals don't and won't kind of fight for as well. I think also, yeah, how you kind of brought up moving beyond secret and sacred items and ancestral remains as well. Obviously, these are kind of in no way easy to address from museum perspectives, but they're kind of something we can pin restitution at too. One of the first things we did at the Science Museum, obviously I'm working with material that's not owned by the Science Museum, so before anyone tries to mount a legal challenge there, it's fine. But one of the first things we did was to kind of expand secret and sacred into kind of including, yeah, utilitarian items historically that have a kind of significance to communities today, either trying to reconnect with living cultures or, items that by virtue of how they were taken are therefore quite sensitive. We've got another question from Charlotte. Charlotte, did you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it out? Yeah, that's fine. So Charlotte was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the educational initiatives relating to your role, and what are your hopes for the impacts of bringing these ideas of kinship and reciprocity to young people in the UK?
Yes. So I think I've done a lot with education in the fact that I'm in a shared office, not with curators, but actually with the education and learning team, which has been brilliant because they're very active throughout our redevelopment. But it's also ended up being the people who do the schools program, the high schools program, or not high schools, secondary, and some GSC. And so just being in the office and being next to people, we've started talking. And the education program with learning is through border crossings. So they're the ones who are leading on the Botany Bay project and some other cool things. But so those initiatives have been born through conversation and through this idea that we're going through capital development. If we don't change our programs now when we're closed, in the busyness of reopening a museum, there's a real fear from that team that if change doesn't happen now and these pilots don't happen, that we'll go back to our ways immediately, because then that's something that's set. So I would say a lot of that is I go in and do a program because every single person has something in their job at Manchester Museum that relates to Indigenous perspectives, and we can think about how to do that. So I've just basically said, you're redoing everything. Let's sit down. What do you like to do? What are your ideas? What are the programs that speak to people? And so the initiatives are very vast, and it's more thinking, what are the things the students need? So to the second part of your question is our schools, Amy, who's in charge of the schools kind of programming, says so many kids don't actually know where food comes from. They don't know that it grows from the ground or grows from trees. They think it comes in plastic in a grocery store, especially the younger kids. And so I'm also thinking, what does Manchester need in 5 years? What knowledge, what are these young kids going to be facing? And food security is one of those, with climate burning and change and all of that. And so trying to build in when it's not a state of trauma, oh my gosh, all of us need to learn how to grow our own food almost overnight because the shelves are empty, but actually that love, that care, and that inspiration and wanting that relationship to do that now before those very real life challenges can suck all the love out of it. And it'll be desperate because that's when we're going to do the quick and easy things and not these longer, more careful relationships. So that's something, at least with that school's program, and a lot of the school's programs are around food or botany and these relationships, and thinking about actually resistance and activism as well. So planting a garden where you shouldn't plant a garden, throwing seeds into the cracks of pavement, and those types of things, is thinking about what do they need as they're growing up, and especially when they're going to be in their teens, when they're at already a really hard place in their life, or just in the future, and building that in when we can with joy, and kind of them as the agents that are bringing it there and reascribing these positive things. So that's been my thinking, but I've taught all ages for a very long time, kind of on the side to the rest of my career, and the different things I've done. And so I'm always thinking, what do my students need? And some of my earliest teaching myself was at a live-in institute for at-risk adolescents. And when you have kids that are coming from such difficult backgrounds, even though I taught the art classes, it was more than that. And so it was always thinking, what do you need when you're not in my classroom? And how can I do that in an ethical and caring way? I didn't pretend to be a therapist because I don't have that experience. I wasn't careless like that, but thinking about what they need and how that applies in a more philosophical approach to knowledge than maybe how to pass that test. So I think that's the initiatives and the ambitions it's born from, and how Indigenous worldviews or knowledge can inspire that, but also create a route back to a way of being in the land.
Yeah, I think that's so important. It's a brilliant answer to that question, but definitely a kind of prompt for everybody as well. You know, how can we sort of imbibe our own practices, whether that's research or curation or, you know, whatever, with care and with kind of responsibility. We've got another question here in the chat. I'm just trying to keep up with the messages. This says, I wonder if you've thought about what an exhibition would look like that engages natural history collections, so returning to that kind of side of things. And as a curator, how would you create that space and share it with the public? Would you include those ethnographic collections alongside natural history material?
Ooh, yes. And actually, for the Belonging Gallery we're working on, it's just one case. So it's not about this giant thing you're about to walk into. I don't know if that's the one. Is we have a case on, so it's about belonging. How do you come to know belonging? You come to know it through, and this is not exhaustive, but through relationships, everyday objects, places, human movement, and actions. And the places case is really confronting it's curated by our assistant curator of zoology, and it's about decolonizing our ideas of the natural world, using comics. So this gallery is full of bespoke comics that are either inspired by an object or it's inspired by a context. So this one has 3 comics, and one of them is about a moche bat pottery. So it's like a face and then it has a bat on top. It's a fantastic piece. But then looking at contemporary ways of being in that area, Indigenous people's ideas of knowledge and what bats meant to them. So we've created a comic that tries to do that. And in writing that comic, we actually had to revise it, is making sure nature isn't mentioned as a place. It's all about kinship and relationships. And it's a dad and a son who are walking through, son's scared of bats. But Dad's like, they're fantastic and they're our relatives and trying to get relation. An earlier version said, that's why we need to be good with nature or something like that. To be fair to Rachel, I'm pretty sure I wrote that part and went, what? Why didn't I connect what I'm doing every day over here? So we've now revised that language out in confronting myself and not in working in silos even within myself. But so we have a case on that. So one's about bats. And so with that one is we do have bats. And also Rachel was brilliant at finding Japanese kind of little sculptures with bats, it's pottery, different types of pottery, I think one's a necklace, but just all these different things to try to show that relationship, those inspirations, because then you start thinking, well, hang on a minute. If I was going to make something with a plant on it or an animal or something else, that would have to be pretty significant to me as a human. So why? What is the relationship there? So thinking about the relationships in those representations. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty nice story. We also are working on a temporary exhibition called Wild, which also tries to critique what wild is. So it's not like I've just told you all these great things and now there's wild. So that one will have a mixture of things, I'm sure. They haven't quite got to the object list yet because it's so early, but that is the intention. So I think it's like pulling out why those relationships exist. And somebody didn't just go, I'm going to make this amazing piece of pottery and put a bat on it arbitrarily.
Those two sound so brilliant. I can't wait to see them once you guys are open. And yeah, it just strikes me that actually museums, for all we kind of, love to hate them, they're great places to do this kind of work, right? They have all of that material, they can bring in people, and they are still, free, which is great. We probably have one more time for one more question, although everyone has now put their questions in the chat. So if you can, answer this very quickly, maybe we can get to both of them. We've got a question here from Lauren. The idea of collaboration is so essential. Do you have any advice on how we can begin to do this, particularly from the UK? How might we kind of approach and begin these conversations around collaboration and sharing knowledge, especially when, yes, this requires a lot of trust and longer term investment, which many precarious academics and museum professionals unfortunately don't have? A really important question there.
Yeah, and I think, one critique is against people who write precarious contracts and put people in this. So number one, the problem's from up there. So I want that to be in view in any answer. I think one thing though is confronting the fact that why are you doing something on this topic, or if it's with a certain group of people, and actually thinking about that relationship base. And so it is worth that slow time. And there's so many opportunities that happen when we slow down, when we get really good relationships, because then we're not just this person that they're going to forget the name of who's come in, but actually is this person that keeps coming up, gets referred to because you've built this relationship. And so I know we're in an increasingly fast, refable kind of atmosphere, or with museums, turn it over, get people in the door, make money in the shop, get them out, get something new to bring them in, and that kind of cycle that we all are in different ways. Because I think to some extent, when it's something that really needs collaboration to be done ethically, if it can't take time, it's not right. Because also time is a cultural construction, as well as the government and universities construction, which also doesn't fit with the cultural construction, but that's them. But it's such a cultural, again in Thailand, which really broke down I used to be very type A. You were a minute late? How dare you mock me with your minute late? Which was so great, because I don't know if anyone knows Thai time, but there's so many times things were 2 hours late. But it was just a part, but because it's not offensive, because it's a part of that and everyone's kind of on this timeline. I was such a happier person when I was living there because of this breakdown of time, and not feeling kind of that pressure of it is probably the best thing about it. Well, not the best thing, but it was definitely a plus. So I think also for some Indigenous peoples, time is a different construction, how things get validated. I mean, the director, Pivy, which I can send a link to her kind of reflection, said, normally you couldn't film reindeer without knowing them for 10 years. But it was because of a connection with a Sami person that she already knew and was working with to create the film, that they were given permission. So it is, and sometimes it's hard because we want to do something, but it's thinking about these are living people. If it doesn't work for their culture, what benefit would it do to it? Because it might just add to continued coloniality and extraction and that intergenerational trauma that continues rather than trying to do something that breaks from it. So there's ways of doing research though. Sorry, that was not a short answer. There's ways of doing research though that is within your positionality. It's within your power. It's within what your gifts you can grant. So sometimes it's just being in conversation with what that might be given timeframes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to be mindful of, and perhaps also to kind of reassess the work that we are capable of doing and kind of equipped to do. So actually, you know, sometimes if you work in universities, you are quite good at writing grants, for example, or you have that experience, right? So it's not necessarily that you are the person that's going to go out and do the work with people. You might actually be better off kind of reapplying your skills, applying for a big chunk of time or something like that. But it is, yeah, it's a really important thing to kind of be aware of the problems that precarity pose. David, are we going to get thrown out at 3:30, or do we have time for the final question? No? Okay, great. Well, there's one more question in here from somebody who's moved to the UK from Santa Fe, so that's exciting. They say, Alexandra, could you speak a little bit more on indigenization and provenance research, specifically in trying to problematize traditional object biographies, which often privilege white and colonial action over Indigenous usages and ownership? Yeah, if you want to just kind of speak to that.
Yes, and actually, I'm going to do that by pointing to my colleague, who's the new curator of living cultures, who's not in the room. Just point you in his direction, Dr. Jambulo Chipangara, who talks so eloquently about social biographies, and that actually, I wish I had the right post-it. I have too many post-its around. We had a meeting of talking about moving away from that object biography and into objects as healing points, but actually in kind of using those as a place to come together to build back that context, that social understanding, that social and what word am I trying to say? But from I don't like source communities because that's just like very extractionist. But going back to the peoples from which the objects were created and used, or their families or descendants, and actually building that context back together. So I think technology in some ways is really useful for kind of that type of research. And Jambulo talks about us possibly one day, this is why in his interview, I just fangirled afterwards, so excited, was actually just putting out our collections without any of that context, that object biography as the primary thing, and just letting people in a very social, collaborative space recontextualize. Always being conscious, though, that you're not asking for people's expertise you should be paying for, but that this is something they benefit from because they'd love to be a part of that. And so also to problematize, because I'm very good at that, is collection searches for museums. And one thing please don't look at, I mean, look at ours, it's awful, it's terrible. Everyone knows it's the worst thing in the world. It's awful, but it's being redone. Behind the scenes and working on it. And I've been working with our developer who's been advocating for years and finally got an accepted grant. So this is all on him. But we've been sitting with what when you search an object, what narratives come up, and how can we get multiple narratives to come up, and how can we actually make sure that ours isn't the first one. So our object biography that we may have is not the first link, but actually you'd have to dig for that. Not in a really hard way that people can't get to it, but actually the first one that pops up might be a diaspora community project that used this work to reinterpret something. And that actually kind of that, because there's the object biography, and to problematize further, it's the description. And the description is the one I'm really sitting with, because oftentimes we think the description includes, this is black, it's plastic, it is used by your hand and connected to a computer by a USB to click. That's a mouse. But it's looking through those object descriptions for the cultural kind of context and white view as well, because then you find out that there's no object description that's objective, and then in your collection search you might pare down that information that comes out, and then very upfront, if there's an object biography, if there's things, put them separate and say where they come from, so that anyone who's reading it, the first thing they read, this came from this person, this is who this person was, they're not Indigenous, this is not knowledge that was passed on. So in provenance research, though, the other part of that, so if somebody asks me for a list of objects related to the Hopi, I'll say, this is what we have that's listed under Hopi. I want to very much make clear that 3 of these provenance are from somebody who was a UK-based collector with an interest, but was not a specialist and is not from the community, and doesn't seem to have published. So somebody from the community that I can't tell you who they are, so it may or may not be Hopi in origin. So I think it's also questioning that, and even the stuff that looks like it could be this week I found objects that were dated to 1930, made of plastic, that came out in the 60s. So like, don't trust anything that even has been put in. So I think that's a part of it also, is, and that involves being with the objects or items or ancestors to look through and look for that extra information. So I think it's always looking at that and being quite upfront with what that is, but looking at that social side, because it's the social side that is so linked to cultural revitalization, not the narrative of like the history of, but like someone's aunt explaining how you would use it, how you would make it, how you'd fix it if it broke, or that joy of what it meant.
Yeah, that's such a lovely answer. I hope that kind of addresses the question that you posed in the chat. Yeah, I'm conscious that we are going to run out of time. Well, we have run out of time, but was there anything else, Alex, that you wanted to kind of raise with us, or I think I froze. Was there anything else that you wanted to raise with us or kind of speak to in this time? Yeah, if you want to kind of mention anything.
Yeah, I think we all have kind of a gift that we can contribute, and all of us will make mistakes in trying to share that gift and to use it. So I think it's really important to think about, what is it about you and your talents and your position, like you talked about the ability to write grants, what is it about that can help with the things that you are very interested in helping with, while being quite open to being told maybe not right now. Being told no is a skill set, but thinking about that, I think, is really, really important. And also, when people are trying to do this work, as well as you need to show humility in the work you do, you need to let others kind of work through it and not jump and attack them every time. And not, if you're waiting for that, please don't. It doesn't, good intentions or not, it's not If you're always waiting for that. Obviously, if there's like structural issues that nobody's been addressing, yes, please. But I think as much as you can to help people through that, because I've seen a lot of people try and then get shot down, and I don't see any more action from a place. So it's being in that conversation and constructive feedback, and letting people have humility as much as you get humility.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful kind of call and prompt to close with. Definitely, as you say, being gracious when you're told no, not right now, or maybe rethink it this way, is a real skill that is quite hard, I think, for people who like to think of themselves as experts, right? To kind of sit with and maybe think about in different ways. But yeah, I just want to thank you so much, Alex, for a really wonderful conversation. It's nice just to see you again anyway and just have a chat. And yeah, thank you everyone for kind of sitting with us and sharing your questions and contributing so wonderfully to this discussion. Hopefully, the first of many around these themes. I don't know if I need to do anything else, David. Is there any kind of protocol I have to follow? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
That was absolutely superb. Thank you so much, both of you. That was such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. I will have to email you my 54 questions, but really, really wonderful. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's stayed with us right to the end. I hope you don't mind, Alex, put your email address in the chat. And Alex has said to me already she's more than happy for people to contact her with further questions. And of course, she said the word collaboration lots of times. So if you have thoughts and ideas, why not reach out? Thank you both once again.
Yeah, thank you so much.